Thank you for that introduction. So my title for my talk, or subtitle, is Friends or Foes, but I'm not really asking a question here. I'm trying to convince you that we are all friends here as surgeons and statisticians and other researchers. Surgical research has come a long way. Surgery's come a long way from being seen as the odd one out in medicine to being an integral part of medical field to modern surgical science. And medical statistics and research, I want to emphasize, not a replacement for surgical judgment. It is a tool, an aid to help you make the right decisions at the right time to be informed by it. And I think that the advantages of statistics and medical research more generally is it exposes, I think, how uncertain we often are. It's when we quantify things numerically, it's often a shock how uncertain, how much the play of chance can mislead us. And it also, this process of coming to a very specific question helps bring out the kind of unwritten and unspoken assumptions in surgical practice. You know, robotic surgery is a way to do this type of operation. But what do we mean by robotic surgery? How are you planning to do that? When you have to do a research study, you have to start to consider the elements about that. And then when you discuss it with others, when you put it together, you realize that not everyone might do it the same way. And how are we going to measure it? And what are we going to say about it? And how long, etc., which patients? And all these things are brought out by the fact that you have to eventually measure something and you have to quantify it. And so these are kind of advantages, I think, that bringing that sort of research and statistical mindset to surgery help us with. I think one of the issues in the past is we've not always spoken the same language, and every area has its own peculiarities. I'm just picking up a few interesting ones, or areas where it's important that we do speak the same thing, and one is about how we talk about studies. An interesting one in surgery is always the surgical case series. What a surgeon has in mind there and what an epidemiologist has in mind are not the same thing. Epidemiologists have a very specific idea of what they think a case series is, where surgeons think, well, that's the series of the cases that I've done, the operations I've done, isn't it? Whereas many epidemiologists would say, well, no, that's actually a cohort study, for example. So sometimes we're not communicating as well as we should together. Another area I think that's worth noting is the humble surgeon. It's not always associated with surgeons, humility, unfairly, is my experience, certainly amongst the research surgeons. But I think also when it comes to research, you could argue surgeons are the most humble, because often you read a paper about surgical practice, about surgery, and there's no mention of the surgeon, nothing about them at all, which is an interesting quirk about how we do research and how we collect information, particularly when it's in a more routine care setting. But I think it's also slightly a misunderstanding that there's a feeling that as a surgeon you want to remove yourself from it, which is a good thing to depersonalize your research. But also you are part, when you're operating on a research participant, part of what is going on. And so knowing something about the surgeons, and it depends on the study how much detail or what would be relevant, is entirely relevant. And often as a reader of a paper, you're left to guess, you know, what type of surgeons do this? Well, it was done in this hospital, and probably it was this type of person. It was probably a consultant, but I don't actually know. It might have been a more junior surgeon, etc., etc. So it's good if we kind of think about it in the same sort of way for the best of reporting research and doing research. Another area I think is important to highlight is about accounting for all participants and operations is a critical thing in research. Now, surgery, as I understand it, is an area that's very able to streamline, to focus, to separate out patients, to stratify, a word that's often used, which is a good thing. But when it comes to research, perhaps there's a tendency then to remove the untidiness of the patient group and not reveal who could have been in that study but aren't in that study for various reasons. Whereas as a researcher, you want to know how everyone got into the study and you want to understand what happens to everyone there. And then last thing I just want to emphasize is about operations, interventions by the same surgeon unit institution. This leads to what statisticians would think of as structured data, or sometimes the word clustered or hierarchical is used. It doesn't mean that this has to affect every single research study, but it's always something to be aware of and think about for your research study. How is that influencing what's been done, and how should it influence what data you collect and how you analyse? This is the traditional pyramid of the hierarchy of evidence. Many of you, I'm sure you've probably all seen something like this in this form. RCTs at the top, working your way down, cohort, case control studies, case series, case reports, expert opinion in the epidemiologist language. And often people will present it this way: highest quality at the top, lowest quality at the bottom, and maybe also the pyramid slightly implying the number of opinions, which is very great and manifold, and then RCTs a bit less as you go up. But beyond that, people often have in the past put systematic reviews at the top and even narrowed that down to systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials. But really they're quite something different, because a systematic review is trying to review the evidence under the criteria that you select. So they really should be kept separate, and I think there's a general recognition that that's true now. But aside from that, is this really useful for surgery? The makeup of the questions, the makeup of the studies that are out there are a little bit different. And really it begs always the question, which wasn't always made explicit: what research question does this sort of approach really apply to? Because you can't do an RCT of everything that you would want to ask a question about. And you might make something like this. This is my slight play at how you might manipulate this. You can see RCTs going down a bit lower and a bit more uneven, and there's a bit of a jumble up here, because it's not quite as simple as that presented before. RCTs are not all the same, and other studies are not all the same, and it depends what question you're asking, what's actually useful for what. And actually now there's a tendency to focus more on what might be called risk of bias, not more abstract quality, which sometimes contains things that don't really actually affect the validity of a study's results per se. If we think about RCTs and observational studies, then, as I say, not all RCTs are created equal. They're not all the same. Some are low quality, or some might be inconclusive. They're small studies. They're often subsets of populations, particular applications. That doesn't mean they're not valid, but then that needs to be understood when you interpret. And one study, no matter how good, is unlikely to be definitive on its own. There's a few handful of very rare examples, but often a study will just move the evidence base on, and it may need another study, and that may or may not be another RCT, depending on what the field is, what the state of evidence, and what the question is you're asking. Traditionally, is kind of in that hierarchy, RCTs at the top against the alternative of observational studies, a cohort study or a non-randomized trial, as it might have been called. And this is my pejorative language, analyze and hope. It's not biased. Often the results were presented, but really that wasn't that realistic often, because the people who were in the new operative group were often very different than those that got the traditional approach, and therefore you were comparing things that were really quite different often. But you could adjust for them, but the way that that was done not always makes things better. It can actually make things worse. More recently, there's been quite a lot of work in research fields outside of surgery, and more increasingly in surgery, about how to do something a bit more clever, and we're going to hear a bit more about propensity score studies later on in the workshop. And there's different ways you can use those, adjust matching, weighting, but there are ways to try and be a bit smarter about trying to get a valid result. And there are other ways that take sort of similar approaches or more robust statistical methods that are becoming a little bit more common. And then there are also designs which in special cases use observational data to create a more relevant control group that might be a bit more reliable and credible than in the past. So the field has really changed. It's not as simple as RCTs good, observational studies bad. And more generally, those were really for a particular question. They were about comparing treatments or operative decision, operate or not for certain patients, or laparoscopic or open for the particular patient at this time. But different questions need different designs. And we need to acknowledge RCTs are expensive and time-consuming, and they're restricted by ethical, practical, and people constraints of various kinds. And a high-quality answer to a very narrow question can have a limited value. By no means are all RCTs that, but some RCTs are that. And there are actually loads of other surgical questions, so you can't say it's about RCT or not. There's lots of research questions out there. How often do a particular type of complications occur? RCT is probably not the best way to get those, certainly if they're rare events. Can we predict Y from X for patients with Z? You can fill in these letters with your favourite area of interest. Can we diagnose condition K? You don't do an RCT to work that out. How consistent are assessments of H? How should a surgeon learn an operation of L? These are all different types of questions that beg potentially different study designs. So to summarise, I think there's recognition. The good news is on both sides of the value of surgical research, and that it is different from, I put in quotes, boring drug studies. Not all drug studies are boring, but some of them are boring. And surgical research is a bit different. It's a bit complicated because of that, but I personally think that makes it interesting. There's been a number of key contributions that research have made to surgical practice. I think there's recognition. The old days of thinking that it's not really relevant, I hope, are gone. And the application of results do need surgical judgment, and they need to be informed by relevant evidence. And that's not just the single study and the numbers, but it's the context and other relevant studies that might come to play. And so lastly, I would say surgical exceptionalism has faded over time. Not the skills, I hope. I hope there's still the exceptional surgical skills out there, but I mean the sort of attitude that I'm a surgeon and the results of other surgeons are not relevant to me. I'm not interested in what other people are doing. I'm not interested in that because I do it the way that I was trained and the way that I do it. My experience is that's very much not the way that people think about it today. I'll finish with some references there.
So we'll now take some questions from the floor. Has anyone got any questions? I can, Dimitri, have you got a mic there?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess my question is, the traditional sort of surgical paper is one method, one set of results, one study that you're reporting. And in part, I think one of what we could take away from your talk is actually sometimes it's useful to have different types of evidence and put it together to put like a picture together, and that might be some quantitative evidence, some qualitative evidence, different types of quantitative data maybe. So do we need to rethink what a surgical paper looks like to give people more flexibility to present data in different ways and in more creative ways maybe?
It's a good question. I think in some ways I'd say yes, in other ways no, so I'm going to hedge my bets. Yes, in the sense that I think we do need to be aware of other relevant evidence. My counter slightly is that both space restrictions and also just presenting information in a consistent manner is really helpful to a reader who's picking something up. Surgeons are very busy, so you want to pick up an RCT paper and read it quite quickly. And that if you do that in a consistent manner, and I think Consort's done a lot for that, it makes that a much easier process to engage with. But maybe we do need other types of papers beyond the sort of traditional review paper, which was sometimes a bit long and wordy and a bit, here's my view, sort of, if I use a pejorative approach to it, and needs something in between for certain areas that pull together relevant pieces of information, or have more joint papers, that a certain project might produce 2 or 3 papers, and maybe that should be a bit more common than it currently is.
Okay, let me ask Jonathan, for the strategic partners, how do we avoid a real sort of statistical faux pas when we are submitting to BJS? Are there any sort of 5 top errors which really get you stressed?
So I'm going to give some responses after each talk, but always double check your numbers. It's so easy to make errors and then have missing people. That's probably my big bugbear, that you spend quite a time reviewing a paper and then you realise that 50 people have gone missing at some point halfway through the article. Got no idea why. So that's probably about my top bugbear. Always report all your methods. So particularly if you're resubmitting papers, it's very easy to have a method section that gets disjointed from what you've actually now presented, not what you said you were going to do 6 months ago, because you got reviewer comments, you decided to cut bits out, and then you're presenting something that doesn't match up. So that's my certainly top 2. Is that enough for now, or do you want some more?
Yeah. And let me just ask, what's the future of the p-value?
P-value. Take it with a pinch of salt, but it has usage in certain areas. I think in RCTs it's here to stay to an extent for a while, because that's what it really makes sense as an experiment of some kind, a planned experiment which you can control, and therefore at least the overall result is coherent. If you've been clear what you're going to analyse and what your main results are, p-values that compare the 2 planned groups make sense. If you're doing other types of studies, and particularly when you're kind of exploring data, then a p-value is next to useless. It's really the kind of quantification of the strengths of the relationships that matter more. So in prognostic studies, predictive studies, modelling, it's not really of any use other than a mechanism to get you where you want to get to, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jonathan.